The bitter taste lingered in my mouth long after the last guest had gone home, but it wasn't from the wedding cake that had made half our reception violently ill. No, this bitterness came from finally understanding exactly what kind of woman I'd married into, and more importantly, what kind of war had just been declared on me. My name is Sarah Chen, and 3 days ago I had what should have been the perfect wedding to David Matthews, the man I'd loved for 4 years. What I got instead was a masterclass in psychological warfare from his mother, Eleanor Matthews, Saint Eleanor, as she was known throughout First Baptist Church of Millbrook, where she'd been the undisputed queen bee for over 2 decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The signs had been there from the beginning, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious to everyone except David, who worshipped the ground his sainted mother walked on. The backhanded compliments about my exotic appearance. The way she'd suddenly develop urgent needs whenever David and I had planned time together. The passive-aggressive comments about how some cultures didn't understand proper Christian values, but I'd played the game, smiled through her microaggressions, and convinced myself that love would conquer all. David was worth it, I told myself. He was kind, successful, and genuinely seemed to see a future with me that transcended his mother's obvious disapproval of his choice in bride. The wedding planning had been a 9-month marathon of psychological endurance. Eleanor had opinions about everything. My dress was too revealing for a church wedding, my choice of flowers wasn't traditional enough, my guest list included too many outsiders who wouldn't appreciate a proper ceremony. Each criticism was delivered with that saccharine smile she'd perfected over years of church committee meetings, wrapped in enough plausible concern that confronting her directly would make me look like the unreasonable one. "I'm just trying to help, dear," she'd say, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I've been planning church events for 20 years. I know what works in our community." Our community. Never my community, always theirs, always excluding me with surgical precision. The cake had been my one non-negotiable item. My grandmother's red velvet recipe, the same one that had graced 3 generations of weddings in my family. It was more than dessert, it was heritage, tradition, love baked into every layer. Eleanor had pushed hard for her friend's bakery, some traditional vanilla monstrosity that would photograph well but taste like cardboard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "But Sarah, dear," she'd said during one particularly tense planning session, "red velvet is so unusual for a church wedding. And homemade? What if something goes wrong? Professional bakers have insurance, liability protection. Wouldn't want to risk food poisoning at such an important event." Food poisoning. The irony wasn't lost on me now that I'd held firm on the cake, one of the few battles I'd actually won. My friend Maria, a professional pastry chef, had agreed to make it as her wedding gift to us. 3 perfect tiers of my grandmother's recipe, decorated with delicate sugar flowers that had taken her weeks to craft. It was a work of art, a labor of love, and the one element of my wedding that felt truly mine. The ceremony itself had gone off without a hitch. Eleanor had managed to upstage me subtly, arriving in a dress that was essentially white with tiny blue flowers, positioning herself prominently in every photo, and somehow managing to be the center of attention during what should have been my processional. But I'd floated down that aisle in my grandmother's restored lace dress, looking into David's eyes, convinced that once we were married, once I was officially family, things would change. The reception started beautifully. The church fellowship hall had been transformed with fairy lights and flowers, the photographer was capturing every moment, and our families were mingling with the easy warmth that comes from shared joy. Even Eleanor seemed to be behaving herself, playing the gracious hostess role she'd perfected over decades of church functions. The cake-cutting ceremony was scheduled for 7 p.m., right after dinner. I'd been looking forward to it all day, not just because of the symbolism, but because I wanted to see people's faces when they tasted my grandmother's recipe. It was the one moment of the reception that would be entirely about my family's traditions. Maria had outdone herself. The cake stood 3 feet tall, a masterpiece of culinary architecture that had guests stopping to take photos all evening. The sugar flowers caught the light like tiny jewels, and the rich red layers were visible through the glass cake stand. It was perfect. The first sign something was wrong came during the toasts. Uncle Robert, my father's brother, had just finished a touching speech about family traditions when he suddenly went pale and excused himself quickly. Then Mrs. Patterson, our elderly neighbor, clutched her stomach and made a similar hasty exit. Within 20 minutes, a third of our guests were either gone or looking distinctly green around the gills. Must be something they ate, Eleanor announced to the remaining guests, her voice carrying just the right note of concern. I did warn about the risks of homemade food for such a large event. One can never be too careful with food safety. The timing was surgical. The guests who felt ill were primarily from my side of the family and our close friends, the people who had been most vocal about how beautiful the cake looked, how excited they were to try it. David's family and the church crowd remained mysteriously unaffected. As I watched my new husband helping people to their cars, apologizing profusely for the food poisoning that had ruined our reception, a cold realization settled over me. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. I cornered Maria in the church kitchen, where she was frantically going through her ingredients and preparation notes. I don't understand, she kept saying, tears streaming down her face. I followed every food safety protocol. The cake was perfect when I delivered it this afternoon. I stayed to help set up. The cake never left my sight until when? I pressed. Until your mother-in-law insisted on rearranging the dessert table. She said it needed to be positioned better for photos. Asked me to help move some other items while she adjusted the cake stand. My blood turned to ice. She was alone with the cake? Only for a few minutes. Maybe 5 at most. Sarah, you don't think? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because suddenly, every poisonous comment Eleanor had made about food safety, every warning about the risks of homemade items, every suggestion that we use a professional baker instead, took on a sinister new meaning. She hadn't just predicted disaster. She'd orchestrated it. The cleanup was surreal. Half-eaten plates of cake were quickly cleared away by the church volunteers, Eleanor's people, and disposed of before anyone could think to save samples for testing. The cake itself disappeared with suspicious efficiency, Maria's masterpiece. Reduced to crumbs in garbage bags that were already being loaded into the church dumpster. Such a shame, Eleanor murmured to anyone who would listen. I tried to warn them about the risks. But young people today think they know better than experience. By the time David and I finally made it to our hotel room, exhausted and emotionally drained, the narrative was already set in stone. Poor Sarah's homemade cake had ruined her own wedding reception. How tragic. How ironic. How completely avoidable. If she'd just listened to wise counsel. I lay awake that night, still in my wedding dress because I didn't have the energy to take it off, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the reception. David slept fitfully beside me, mumbling apologies in his sleep for the disaster that had befallen our special day, but I wasn't thinking about apologies. I was thinking about the satisfied gleam in Eleanor's eyes as she'd supervised the disposal of the evidence. I was thinking about the way she'd consoled guests with just the right mixture of sympathy and vindication. I was thinking about how she'd managed to turn my wedding day into a public humiliation while maintaining her image as the concerned mother-in-law who tried to prevent exactly this tragedy. Most of all, I was thinking about how this was just the beginning. Eleanor Matthews had just made the mistake of her life. She declared war on me on my wedding day, in front of everyone I loved, using my own family traditions as the weapon against me. She'd humiliated me, poisoned my guests, and turned what should have been the happiest day of my life into a cautionary tale about why you shouldn't trust outsiders with important events. But Eleanor had made one crucial error in her calculations. She'd assumed I was just another naive young woman who could be easily crushed by her subtle manipulations. She'd assumed I would accept this humiliation, internalize the shame, and spend the rest of my marriage trying to prove myself worthy of her acceptance. She was wrong. What Eleanor didn't know was that I wasn't just David's wife now. I was a strategic communications consultant who specialized in crisis management and reputation rehabilitation. I'd spent 5 years learning how to craft narratives, control information flow, and turn public opinion. I'd helped Fortune 500 companies recover from scandals that should have destroyed them. And now, lying in my hotel room in my rumpled wedding dress, I began to plan something Eleanor would never see coming. She'd used her position as the church's golden child to destroy my reputation in a single evening. She'd leveraged decades of goodwill and community trust to make me look irresponsible and culturally tone-deaf. Time to show her how a real professional operated. I reached for my phone and began making notes. Every detail of the evening, every witness to Eleanor's behavior, every inconsistency in her story. I documented the timeline, the guest list, the mysterious pattern of who got sick and who didn't. Most importantly, I started researching. Eleanor Matthews might be the queen bee of First Baptist Church, but even queens had histories. Everyone had secrets, weaknesses, moments of poor judgment that they'd prefer to keep buried. And I had both. The skills and the motivation to uncover every single one. The war she'd started on my wedding day was about to become her worst nightmare. As dawn broke through the hotel room windows, I finally took off my wedding dress and hung it carefully in the closet. The woman who put on jeans and a sweater was different from the one who'd walked down the aisle 12 hours earlier. I was no longer the hopeful bride trying to win over her difficult mother-in-law. I was a weapon, disguised as a Sunday school teacher, and Eleanor Matthews was about to learn that some battles aren't worth starting. The first phase of my plan would require patience, observation, and careful positioning. I needed to understand the full scope of Eleanor's influence before I could begin systematically dismantling it. The church community that had embraced her for 2 decades was about to discover that their saint had clay feet, very dirty clay feet. I opened my laptop and began typing. If Eleanor wanted to play games with reputations, I'd show her how a professional played to win. The transformation began Monday morning when I walked through the doors of First Baptist Church of Millbrook for the first time as Mrs. David Matthews. Eleanor was already there, of course, arranging flowers in the sanctuary with the practiced efficiency of someone who considered the church her personal domain. "Sarah, dear," she called out, her voice carrying that perfect blend of sympathy and superiority. "How are you feeling? Such a terrible way to end your special day. I've been telling everyone how sorry I am about the food situation." The food situation. As if a mysterious illness that struck down half my wedding guests was merely an unfortunate coincidence rather than a calculated attack. "I'm doing well, Eleanor," I replied, matching her saccharine tone. "Actually, I was hoping to get more involved in church activities. David's always talking about how much this community means to him." The flash of surprise in her eyes was quickly masked, but I caught it. She'd expected me to retreat, to lick my wounds and avoid the very place where my humiliation had been so publicly displayed. Instead, here I was, volunteering to become more deeply embedded in her territory. "How wonderful," she managed, though her smile seemed forced. "We always need fresh perspectives and willing hands." Fresh perspectives. The irony wasn't lost on me. Over the next 2 weeks, I made myself indispensable. I volunteered for the nursery ministry, joined the women's Bible study, and signed up to help with the upcoming fall festival. Each position gave me access to different circles within the church, different sources of information about the woman who'd made herself my enemy. The nursery duty was particularly enlightening. Young mothers, exhausted from managing toddlers, were surprisingly chatty during the Sunday service breaks. I learned that Eleanor had strong opinions about child-rearing that she wasn't shy about sharing. She actually told Jessica that she was spoiling little Tommy by picking him up when he cried, whispered Amanda, a first-time mother who looked perpetually frazzled. Said it would make him manipulative. "The baby's only 6 months old." I nodded sympathetically, filing the information away. That must have been hard to hear. It was. Jessica was in tears. "But you know Mrs. Matthews, she means well. She just has very traditional ideas about discipline." Traditional ideas about discipline. Another data point in the growing profile I was building, the women's Bible study proved even more valuable. Led by Eleanor herself, it was a masterclass in passive-aggressive control disguised as spiritual guidance. She had a gift for making criticism sound like concern, judgment feel like love. "We need to pray for young women today," Eleanor announced. "During our study of Proverbs 31. They're so influenced by worldly ideas about independence and career success. They don't understand that a woman's true fulfillment comes through supporting her husband and serving her family." Her eyes found mine across the circle. Of course, some of us learn these lessons later in life. It's never too late to embrace God's design for womanhood. The message was clear: my career was ungodly, my independence was selfishness, and my late adoption of her son's faith made me a second-class Christian at best. but the other women's reactions were more interesting than Eleanor's predictable commentary. I saw tiny flinches, quickly suppressed eye rolls, the subtle body language of people who'd heard these lectures before and were growing tired of them. "She's always been like that," confided Martha, one of the older church members, as we cleaned up after the study. "Even when she was young, Eleanor had opinions about how everyone else should live their lives. Some things never change." I made a mental note to cultivate Martha further. Longtime church members were repositories of institutional memory, and institutional memory often included buried scandals. The Fall Festival Planning Committee was where I really hit gold. Eleanor chaired the committee, naturally, and ran it with the iron fist of someone who'd never encountered meaningful opposition. But committees, I'd learned in my professional life, were hotbeds of suppressed resentment and competing agendas. "The booth assignments are already decided," Eleanor announced during our first meeting, distributing a typed list that looked like it had been carved in stone. "The same families handle the same booths every year. It's tradition." I scanned the list, noting how Eleanor's friends and allies had been assigned the most prestigious positions: the baking contest, the silent auction, the children's games. Meanwhile, newer members and anyone who'd ever crossed Eleanor found themselves relegated to cleanup duty or manning the less desirable booths. "What about the haunted house?" asked Jennifer, a newer member whose family had joined just last year. "My kids have been asking if they could help with that." Eleanor's smile turned glacial. "The haunted house requires mature judgment and organizational skills. Perhaps next year, once your family has been here longer." The subtext was clear: know your place, newcomer, but I saw opportunity in Eleanor's rigid hierarchy. Excluded people made excellent allies, and there seemed to be no shortage of church members who'd been on the receiving end of Eleanor's subtle cruelties. I began what I mentally called the listening tour. Coffee dates with frustrated committee members, casual conversations with sidelined volunteers, sympathetic ears for anyone who'd felt steamrolled by Eleanor's benevolent dictatorship. The stories that emerged painted a picture of systematic manipulation stretching back years. The young pastor who'd been quietly pressured to resign after suggesting changes to the traditional service format. The widow who'd been frozen out of her longtime position as church pianist after remarrying too quickly for Eleanor's tastes. The couple who'd stopped attending altogether after Eleanor publicly questioned their financial priorities when they bought a new car instead of increasing their tithing. Each story was carefully couched in Christian language: concern for proper stewardship, protection of church traditions, guidance for spiritual growth. But the pattern was unmistakable. Eleanor used her position as the church's moral authority to punish anyone who challenged her control or failed to meet her standards. Most interestingly, I discovered that Eleanor's influence extended far beyond the church walls. She was president of the Historical Society, chaired the annual charity gala, and served on the school board. Her web of social control encompassed nearly every significant institution in Millbrook. "She's got her finger in every pie," explained Tom, the church treasurer, during a conversation about the festival budget. "Sometimes I think she forgets that other people might have good ideas too." I was beginning to understand the true scope of what I was up against. Eleanor wasn't just a church bully, she was the unofficial mayor of Millbrook's social establishment, a position she'd built through decades of careful networking and strategic positioning. But every empire had weak points, and I was starting to identify hers. The first crack appeared during a finance committee meeting. Eleanor had been arguing against upgrading the church's sound system, claiming it was an unnecessary expense that showed poor stewardship of God's money. "We need to be good examples of thrift and humility," she declared. "Fancy equipment sends the wrong message to our community." But Tom, the treasurer, had done his homework. "Actually, Mrs. Matthews, the bid comes in under budget, and we've had multiple complaints about people not being able to hear sermons clearly. Especially our elderly members." I watched Eleanor's face carefully as Tom continued his presentation. For just a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw something that looked remarkably like panic. She was losing control of the narrative, and she didn't like it. "Of course, we want our elderly members to hear clearly," she recovered quickly. "I'm just concerned about the message we send when we spend money on luxuries instead of missions." It was a masterful deflection, frame opposition to her position as opposition to elderly people and missions work. But Tom had anticipated this. The mission's budget is fully funded for this year, with a 15% increase over last year. And actually, better sound quality would help our live stream ministry reach more people. Isn't that missions work too? I had to suppress a smile. Tom was clearly someone who'd learned how to navigate Eleanor's manipulations through hard experience. The vote passed 7-3, with Eleanor on the losing side for what I suspected was the first time in years. As the meeting broke up, I made sure to congratulate Tom on his thorough presentation. "Thanks," he said, looking slightly surprised. "I just think we need to make decisions based on facts, not feelings." I filed Tom away as a potential ally. Anyone who'd successfully outmaneuvered Eleanor once could probably be convinced to do it again. My research was also revealing interesting details about Eleanor's past. Through careful questioning of longtime members, I learned that she hadn't always been the undisputed queen of First Baptist. She'd married into the church when she wed David's father, Richard, 35 years ago. Richard was a catch, Martha told me during one of our coffee chats. Successful businessman, pillar of the community, eligible bachelor. Eleanor swooped in from Richmond and landed him within 6 months. She wasn't from Millbrook originally. Oh no, dear. She was working as a secretary in Richmond when they met. Richard was there on business. She was younger then, of course, and quite pretty. But also quite determined. Martha's pause spoke volumes. I pressed gently for more details. Well, there was some talk at the time about how quickly everything moved. Richard had been dating Janet Crawford, lovely girl, from a good local family. They'd been together for 2 years, and everyone expected an engagement announcement. Then suddenly he brings this woman from Richmond to church, and 6 months later, they're married. What happened to Janet? Moved away shortly after the wedding. Married a doctor in Charlotte, I heard. But the whole thing left some hurt feelings. Eleanor never quite fit in with the established families, you know. She had to work harder to prove herself. This was fascinating. Eleanor's position wasn't as unassailable as she'd made it seem. She was essentially an outsider who'd spent decades carefully constructing her authority. Which meant that authority could be deconstructed. I began to understand Eleanor's hostility toward me in a new light. I represented her own past, the outsider woman marrying into the community, potentially disrupting established relationships. The difference was that I wasn't trying to overthrow her, just coexist. But Eleanor saw any new presence as a potential threat to her carefully built empire. My investigation also revealed that Eleanor's charitable work, while extensive, followed interesting patterns. She gravitated toward high-visibility causes that enhanced her reputation while avoiding anything that might challenge her worldview or require real sacrifice. The historical society she chaired focused exclusively on preserving stories of prominent white families, despite Millbrook's rich black history. The charity gala she organized raised money for generic causes like children in need rather than addressing specific local problems. Her school board service concentrated on maintaining traditional curricula and opposing any changes that might reflect modern educational approaches. Eleanor was, I realized, a professional maintainer of status quo, someone whose entire identity was built on keeping things exactly as they were, with her firmly at the top of the social hierarchy. But times were changing, and I was about to accelerate that process dramatically. My first move was subtle but strategic. I volunteered to help update the church's website and social media presence, suggesting that we needed to better connect with younger families in the community. Social media? Eleanor looked as if I'd suggested installing a casino in the sanctuary. I'm not sure that's appropriate for a church. We have more traditional ways of reaching people. Of course, I agreed readily. But we want to make sure we're welcoming to young families like David and me. A lot of people research churches online before visiting. Pastor Wilson, a kind man in his 50s who'd learned to navigate Eleanor's opinions carefully, seized on the idea. That makes a lot of sense. We've been talking about ways to attract younger members. I saw Eleanor's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. The pastor's support made it harder for her to object without seeming obstructionist. I suppose it couldn't hurt to explore the idea, she conceded. As long as we maintain appropriate standards. Within 2 weeks, I had administrative access to all of the church's digital platforms. I also had a legitimate reason to interview longtime members about church history, gather photos from past events, and document the community's stories. The official purpose was to create content that would showcase the church's rich heritage and welcoming community. The unofficial purpose was to gather intelligence on every significant relationship, conflict, and power dynamic within Eleanor's sphere of influence. I was building a detailed map of her empire, identifying its foundations, its weak points, and the pressure points that could bring it all tumbling down, but I was also establishing myself as a helpful, tech-savvy church member who was dedicated to serving the community. When the time came to make my move, I wanted to be seen as a trusted insider, not an outsider with an agenda. The irony wasn't lost on me. Eleanor had tried to use my outsider status against me at my own wedding. Now I was using that same dynamic to position myself as the fresh voice the church needed, while she increasingly looked like a relic from a less inclusive past. Phase 2 of my plan was about to begin, and Eleanor Matthews had no idea what was coming. She'd taught me a valuable lesson on my wedding day: reputation was everything in a small community. Now it was time to return the favor and show her just how quickly a carefully constructed image could crumble. After all, the higher the pedestal, the farther the fall. The opportunity I'd been waiting for arrived disguised as the annual church directory update. Pastor Wilson had asked me to coordinate the project, praising my organizational skills and fresh perspective. Eleanor had smiled and nodded her approval, probably thinking it was busy work that would keep me occupied and out of more important church business. She had no idea she'd just handed me the keys to her kingdom. Church directories might seem mundane, but they were goldmines of information. They contained not just contact details, but family histories, volunteer roles, committee memberships, and donation patterns. More importantly, updating them required me to interview every church family, giving me legitimate access to their stories, complaints, and long-buried grievances. My first strategic interview was with Janet Crawford, now Janet Morrison, who had returned to Millbrook 6 months earlier to care for her aging mother. The same Janet that Eleanor had displaced 35 years ago when she married Richard Matthews. We met at the local coffee shop, ostensibly to update her directory information and discuss her potential involvement in church activities. Janet was elegant in the way that came from good breeding rather than effort, with silver hair and kind eyes that held depths of experience. I wasn't sure about returning to First Baptist, she admitted, stirring her latte thoughtfully. So many memories, you know. But Pastor Wilson is nothing like the old pastor, and times change. It must feel strange being back after so long, I said carefully. David mentioned his father spoke fondly of you. Janet's smile was wry but not bitter. Richard was a good man. We were young, thought we had all the time in the world to figure things out. Then Eleanor arrived like a whirlwind, and suddenly everything was urgent and decided. She paused, seeming to weigh her words. I don't hold grudges, Sarah. Life worked out well for me, my husband was wonderful, my children are thriving. But I did watch from afar over the years, and I noticed patterns. Patterns? Eleanor has a gift for making herself indispensable while making others feel expendable. She's done it to several women over the years. Usually when they pose some kind of threat to her position. Janet leaned forward slightly. I heard about your wedding reception. The cake incident. It reminded me of something that happened about 15 years ago. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. Oh? There was a young woman named Lisa who married into the Hendersons, good family, been here for generations. Lisa was a professional chef, had trained in Paris, quite accomplished. She offered to cater the church's anniversary celebration, said she'd do it at cost as her gift to the community. Janet sipped her coffee, her eyes distant with memory. Eleanor was in charge of the planning committee, of course. She graciously accepted Lisa's offer, but then, well, the food was terrible. Under-seasoned, some dishes were burnt, others were undercooked. Lisa was mortified, swore that wasn't how she'd prepared anything. The parallels were unmistakable. What happened to Lisa? She left town within a year. Divorced, actually. Said she couldn't take the whispers and sideways looks. Her cooking career never recovered, word travels in our industry, and once you're known for a disaster. Janet met my eyes directly. The interesting thing was, Eleanor had insisted on doing a final quality check on all the food before service. Said she wanted to make sure everything was perfect for such an important event. My blood ran cold. This wasn't the first time Eleanor had sabotaged someone's food to destroy their reputation. It was a pattern, a calculated method of eliminating threats to her authority. Did anyone ever question what happened? A few people had suspicions, but Eleanor was so sympathetic, so apologetic about the unfortunate incident. She even started a small fund to help cover Lisa's embarrassment, which just reinforced the narrative that poor Lisa had failed spectacularly. Janet finished her coffee and gathered her purse. I'm not one for gossip, Sarah, but I believe in protecting people when I can. You seem like a strong young woman, but Eleanor, she's had decades to perfect her methods. As Janet left, I sat in the coffee shop processing what I'd learned. Eleanor wasn't just petty or controlling, she was methodical. She had a playbook for destroying women she saw as threats, and my wedding had just been her latest performance, but now I knew her methods, and knowledge was power. My next move required careful timing. The church's fall festival was 3 weeks away, and Eleanor's control over the planning committee was beginning to show cracks. Several committee members had approached me privately with concerns about the booth assignments, the budget allocations, and Eleanor's increasingly autocratic leadership style. She's assigned my family to garbage duty for the 3rd year running, complained Mark Stevens, whose wife had made the mistake of suggesting improvements to the children's area layout. Meanwhile, her book club friends get the prime spots every single year. Jennifer, the newer member who'd been shut down about the haunted house, was more direct. I'm starting to think Mrs. Matthews doesn't want new families to feel welcome. It's like she's protecting her inner circle from any outside influence. I positioned myself as a sympathetic listener, someone who understood their frustrations but was too new to have any real power to change things. It was perfect cover for what I was actually doing, documenting every complaint, every instance of favoritism, every example of Eleanor's arbitrary rule. The breakthrough came during a committee meeting where Eleanor announced last-minute changes to the festival layout. She'd moved the bake sale booth, traditionally run by the youth group as their major fundraiser, to a less visible location to make room for her Historical Society display. The Historical Society booth needs more foot traffic, she explained, with that tone that brooked no argument. Education is more important than fundraising. Tom, the treasurer who'd successfully challenged her before, raised his hand. Actually, Mrs. Matthews, the youth group's bake sale funds their mission trip. Moving them to the back corner could hurt their fundraising significantly. Eleanor's smile turned brittle. I'm sure the young people will find creative ways to draw attention to their booth. They're so energetic these days. It was a masterful dismissal, framing the youth group's concerns as trivial while positioning herself as the guardian of more serious pursuits. But I saw several committee members exchange glances, and not approving ones. After the meeting, I approached Tom casually. That seemed like a tough call about the booth locations. He shook his head. It's not really about the locations. It's about the fact that she made the decision unilaterally and then presented it as fait accompli. That's not how committees are supposed to work. Have you thought about raising that with Pastor Wilson? I've considered it, but... Tom shrugged helplessly. She's been here so long, has so much influence. It would be my word against hers, and she'd find a way to make me look like I was causing unnecessary conflict. I nodded sympathetically, filing away another piece of evidence about Eleanor's intimidation tactics. People weren't afraid of her because she was right, they were afraid because she was powerful, but power, I was learning, was often more fragile than it appeared. My digital access to the church's systems had revealed interesting patterns in Eleanor's volunteer work. She consistently signed up for high-visibility roles that came with recognition but avoided behind-the-scenes work that actually required effort. More telling, she had a habit of suddenly developing health issues or family emergencies whenever unglamorous tasks needed to be done. The church's financial records, which I could access through my website work, showed another pattern. Eleanor's family donated generously, but always in ways that maximized public recognition. Their contributions funded the historical display in the sanctuary, the flowers that bore small plaques with their names, and the annual scholarship that was announced with great fanfare at every graduation ceremony. Meanwhile, I discovered through careful questioning that many families gave more than the Matthews but did so quietly, without seeking recognition. Eleanor wasn't actually the most generous member of the congregation, she was just the most visible about her generosity. I began documenting everything in a private database, cross-referencing Eleanor's claims with observable facts. Her stories about her charitable work, her role in church decisions, her relationships with community leaders, all of it went under the microscope. The picture that emerged was of someone who'd spent decades crafting a false narrative about her own importance and influence. She was skilled at taking credit for others' ideas, positioning herself at the center of other people's successes, and rewriting history to enhance her own role. But false narratives could be corrected, and I was uniquely qualified to do the correcting. My background in strategic communications had taught me that the most effective way to destroy someone's reputation wasn't through direct attack, it was through erosion. Let people discover the truth for themselves, provide them with the tools to see past the facade, and then step back while the target's own actions completed their downfall. Eleanor had spent my wedding reception letting people watch her predict disaster and then see that disaster unfold exactly as she'd warned. It had been a masterful piece of manipulation, using my own family's traditions against me while positioning herself as the wise voice that had tried to prevent tragedy. Now it was time to return the favor. The church's online presence gave me multiple platforms to work with. The website, the Facebook page, the email newsletter, and the new Instagram account I'd created were all tools that could shape narratives and influence perceptions. I started subtly blog posts about the church's history that happened to highlight contributions from families Eleanor had marginalized. Social media features on volunteer work that showcased behind-the-scenes heroes rather than committee chairs. Newsletter articles about the value of quiet service and humble leadership. None of it mentioned Eleanor directly, but it gradually shifted the focus away from her preferred narrative of herself as the church's indispensable leader. Instead, it highlighted the collaborative nature of the church community and the importance of every member's contribution. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People felt seen and appreciated in ways they hadn't before. Comments poured in thanking me for recognizing overlooked volunteers, for sharing forgotten stories, for making everyone feel valued. Eleanor noticed. I could see it in the way she watched me during committee meetings, the slight tightening around her eyes when people praised the new communication approach, the careful questions she asked about my content planning process. She was beginning to understand that something had changed, but she couldn't quite identify the threat yet. I was still the helpful daughter-in-law, the eager volunteer, the supportive church member. Nothing I was doing could be criticized directly without seeming petty or controlling, but her kingdom was slowly shifting beneath her feet. The real test came when I proposed a new feature for the church newsletter, Member Spotlight, where different families would share their stories and experiences. It seemed innocent enough, a way to help people get to know each other better and celebrate the diversity of backgrounds within our congregation. Eleanor's enthusiasm was lukewarm, but she couldn't object without seeming unwelcoming to new ideas. I suppose it could be interesting, she allowed. As long as we maintain appropriate standards for what's included. Appropriate standards. Her way of maintaining editorial control over which stories got told and how they were framed. Of course, I agreed readily. I was thinking we could start with some of our longtime members, get their perspectives on how the church has grown and changed over the years. I submitted my first interview request through Pastor Wilson, asking to feature the Peterson family, longtime members who'd been quietly serving the church for decades while Eleanor took credit for many of their initiatives. Mrs. Peterson was thrilled to be asked. During our interview, she shared stories I'd never heard about the church's early integration efforts, the food pantry program she'd actually founded, and the community outreach work that had been her passion project for 15 years. I've never been one for the spotlight, she said modestly. But it's been rewarding to see how these programs have grown. Even when others get the recognition, what matters is that people are being helped. When the newsletter came out, featuring Mrs. Peterson's photo and her inspiring story of decades of quiet service, the response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. People commented about how they'd never known she was behind so many programs they'd benefited from. Several mentioned being surprised to learn the true history of initiatives they'd thought were more recent. Eleanor's reaction was carefully controlled but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. She congratulated Mrs. Peterson warmly, but made sure to mention her own role in supporting and expanding the programs described in the article. But the narrative had already shifted. People were starting to look beyond the surface, to ask questions about who was really doing the work versus who was taking the credit. I was just getting started. My next member spotlight featured Janet Morrison, the woman who'd returned to Millbrook after her husband's death. Janet's story of rebuilding her life, returning to her hometown, and finding renewed purpose in community service resonated deeply with readers. More importantly, it established Janet as a respected voice in the community, someone with both historic ties to the church and fresh perspective on its future. People began seeking her opinions, including her in conversations, treating her as an elder stateswoman rather than an outsider returning home. Eleanor couldn't object to Janet's inclusion without revealing her own insecurities about the past. But I could see the tension in her posture during church services, the way she positioned herself to intercept conversations between Janet and other members, the subtle attempts to redirect attention back to herself. The foundation of Eleanor's power was starting to crack, and she was beginning to feel it, but I wasn't done establishing the new narrative. The fall festival was approaching, and it would provide the perfect stage for the next phase of my plan. Eleanor had no idea that her own methods were about to be turned against her, or that the weapon she'd used to destroy my reputation would soon be aimed directly at the empire she'd spent decades building. After all, she'd taught me everything I needed to know about the power of public humiliation. Time to show her what happened when a professional took those lessons to their logical conclusion. The week before the fall festival, I made a discovery that changed everything. While organizing old church documents for digitization, I found a box of records from the early 1990s that had somehow escaped Eleanor's careful curation of church history. Hidden among routine committee minutes and budget reports was a folder marked Personnel Matters in faded ink. Inside were complaints. Formal, written complaints about Eleanor's behavior dating back over 2 decades. The first was from a youth pastor who'd been quietly let go in 1994. His letter to the church board detailed how Eleanor had systematically undermined his authority, questioned his methods in front of teenagers, and spread concerns about his modern approaches to youth ministry. The letter painted a picture of someone who couldn't tolerate any challenge to traditional power structures. Another complaint came from the church pianist who'd been replaced in 1998. She documented how Eleanor had criticized her musical choices, recruited allies to question her performance, and eventually orchestrated her removal by claiming the congregation needed more traditional hymns for our traditional values. But the most damning document was a letter from Pastor Williams' predecessor, Pastor Gardner, who'd served the church for nearly a decade before resigning abruptly in 2003. His private letter to the regional denominational office described a pattern of manipulation and control that made effective ministry nearly impossible. Mrs. Matthews has positioned herself as the unofficial gatekeeper of church policy, he wrote. Any initiative that doesn't originate with her or receive her explicit blessing faces immediate and organized opposition. She's created an atmosphere where church members are afraid to suggest changes or voice dissenting opinions. This is not healthy church governance. The letter went on to detail specific incidents where Eleanor had sabotaged church programs, spread rumors about members who challenged her authority, and used her influence to punish families that didn't align with her vision of proper church behavior. Each document was a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing that Eleanor's behavior wasn't recent or reactive. It was a decades-long pattern of systematic control and manipulation. More importantly, these complaints had been filed with church leadership, which meant people in authority had known about her behavior and chosen to look the other way. I photographed every document carefully, creating a digital archive that would be much harder for Eleanor to make disappear than the originals. Then I began cross-referencing the names mentioned in the complaints with current church members, tracking down witnesses who could corroborate the documented incidents. What I found was a network of former church members who'd been driven away by Eleanor's tactics. Some had joined other congregations in neighboring towns. Others had stopped attending church altogether. But all of them had stories to tell about the woman who'd made their spiritual community feel unwelcoming or hostile. The most revealing conversation was with Margaret Foster, the former pianist mentioned in the 1998 complaint. She now played for a Methodist church 2 towns over but agreed to meet me for lunch when I reached out through mutual acquaintances. I knew this day would come, she said after I'd carefully explained my interest in church history. Eleanor Matthews is like a cancer, she spreads slowly until she's infected everything healthy about a community. Margaret's story was chillingly similar to what had happened to Lisa, the chef Janet had told me about. Eleanor had started with subtle criticisms, suggesting that Margaret's hymn selections were too contemporary, questioning whether certain songs were appropriate for worship, hinting that the congregation might prefer more traditional music. She never confronted me directly, Margaret explained. Instead, she'd approach other people with her concerns, get them to question my choices. She'd say things like, "I'm sure Margaret means well, but don't you think that song was a bit too upbeat for Communion Sunday?" The campaign had escalated when Margaret chose a contemporary arrangement of a classic hymn for Easter service. Eleanor had publicly praised the choice during the service but privately expressed concerns to key church members about the direction music was heading. By the time I realized what was happening, half the congregation thought I was trying to turn our traditional service into a rock concert, Margaret said bitterly. Eleanor had poisoned the well so thoroughly that anything I did was viewed with suspicion. The final blow had come when Margaret chose a piece she thought would please everyone, a beautiful, traditional arrangement of Amazing Grace. But something had gone wrong during the service. The organ had malfunctioned repeatedly, creating embarrassing gaps in the music during what should have been the worship service's most moving moment. I had that organ serviced regularly. It was old but reliable. But that Sunday, it kept cutting out at the worst possible moments. By the end of the service, people were looking at me like I hadn't prepared properly. Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping. The thing is, Eleanor's husband Richard was on the board of the company that serviced the organ. She had access to that building, knew the equipment. And she was so sympathetic afterward, so understanding about technical difficulties and the pressure of public performance. The pattern was becoming clear. Eleanor didn't just spread rumors or create social pressure, she actively sabotaged people's performances, then positioned herself as the sympathetic voice of wisdom who'd tried to prevent the very disasters she'd caused. Armed with this new understanding of Eleanor's methods, I realized the fall festival wasn't just an opportunity to continue building my alternative narrative, it was the perfect setting for Eleanor to hang herself with her own rope. I began preparing my trap. The festival setup day arrived with the usual controlled chaos of community events. Volunteers carried tables, strung lights, and arranged booths while Eleanor moved through the organized confusion like a general inspecting troops. She had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. The cotton candy machine shouldn't be so close to the book sale, she declared to no one in particular. Sweet sticky fingers and pages don't mix well. The children's game area needs better supervision. We can't have liability issues. Someone needs to remind the barbecue crew about proper food safety protocols. We don't want another incident. She caught herself before finishing the sentence, but several people had heard enough to know she was referencing my wedding reception. I watched her work the crowd, noting how she managed to insert herself into every decision while making. It seemed like helpful guidance rather than micromanagement. But I also noticed the subtle eye rolls, the brief expressions of frustration that people quickly suppressed. Eleanor's authority was still intact, but it was beginning to feel heavy rather than natural to the people bearing its weight. My booth assignment was perfect for my purposes, information and visitor welcome, positioned near the main entrance where I could observe the entire festival while appearing to focus on greeting newcomers and helping lost visitors. Eleanor had probably thought she was giving me busy work that would keep me occupied and out of more important activities. Instead, she'd given me the ideal vantage point to document everything that was about to unfold. The festival officially opened at noon on Saturday. Families streamed through the entrance, kids ran toward the game booths, and the scent of barbecue and funnel cakes filled the air. Everything seemed to be running smoothly under Eleanor's orchestrated supervision, until the first crisis hit, the inflatable bounce house, rented from a company Eleanor had insisted on using despite concerns about their reputation, deflated dramatically just as a group of children were climbing inside. No one was seriously hurt, but several kids were trapped briefly, crying and frightened while parents rushed to help. Eleanor was on the scene immediately, taking charge of the situation with practiced efficiency. "Everyone stay calm," she announced. "These things happen with older equipment. Let's focus on making sure the children are okay." But I had positioned myself to overhear her earlier conversation with the rental company representative, a wiry man named Dave who'd been setting up equipment since dawn. "Ma'am, I need to tell you again, this unit's been having problems," he'd said during setup. "We offered to bring a newer one for the same price, but your contract specifically requested this model." Eleanor had waved off his concerns. "We've used this equipment before without problems. I'm sure it will be fine for one day." Now, as she comforted frightened children and reassured worried parents, Eleanor's earlier dismissal of safety warnings took on a different character. She hadn't just ignored expert advice, she'd actively chosen to use equipment she'd been warned about, prioritizing cost or familiarity over safety, but the crisis was handled efficiently, and most festival goers quickly moved on to other activities. Eleanor had demonstrated her leadership during an emergency, which actually enhanced her reputation among people who hadn't overheard the earlier conversation. It was exactly what I'd expected. Eleanor was skilled at turning near disasters into opportunities to showcase her competence, especially when she'd had advance warning about potential problems. The second crisis followed a similar pattern. The cotton candy machine broke down during the afternoon rush, leaving a long line of disappointed children and frustrated parents. Eleanor appeared quickly with an alternative solution. She'd anticipated this possibility and arranged for a backup vendor to be on standby. "I've been doing this for 20 years, she explained to grateful parents as a new cotton candy station was quickly established. "You learn to plan for these things." Again, her foresight and preparation made her look like a competent leader who'd prevented a minor disaster from becoming a major disappointment. Parents praised her planning skills, children got their cotton candy, and Eleanor's reputation for reliable event management was reinforced, but I'd been watching and listening carefully throughout the day. During the bounce house crisis, I'd noticed Eleanor's complete lack of surprise at the equipment failure. During the cotton candy machine breakdown, I'd observed how quickly she'd produced the backup vendor's contact information, as if it had been readily at hand. Most telling was her behavior before each crisis hit. She'd positioned herself nearby, ready to respond immediately when problems arose. For someone supposedly focused on overseeing the entire festival, she'd shown remarkable prescience about where her attention would be needed. By evening, I'd documented a pattern that would have been invisible to casual observers but was damning to anyone who understood Eleanor's history. She'd created problems and then solved them, generating crises that allowed her to demonstrate her indispensability while positioning herself as the wise voice who'd prevented worse disasters. It was the same playbook she'd used at my wedding reception, scaled up for a larger audience, but this time, I was ready. During the festival's closing ceremony, Eleanor took the microphone to thank volunteers and celebrate another successful community event. She looked radiant in the evening light, basking in the appreciation of families who'd enjoyed the day despite its minor glitches. "Events like this don't happen by accident," she told the gathered crowd. "They require careful planning, attention to detail, and the willingness to solve problems quickly when they arise. I'm proud of how our community came together today to ensure everyone had a wonderful time." The applause was genuine and warm. Eleanor had earned it, at least from the perspective of people who'd only seen her handle crises effectively rather than create them in the first place. As families began packing up and volunteers started the cleanup process, I made my way to the church office where I'd been storing festival documentation throughout the day. Photos, incident reports, volunteer schedules, vendor contracts, everything was carefully organized in preparation for the post-event summary I'd volunteered to compile, but I also had other documentation, recordings of key conversations, photos of Eleanor's positioning before each crisis, and most importantly, copies of the vendor contracts that showed she'd specifically requested equipment that had known problems. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Eleanor had orchestrated manageable crises that allowed her to showcase her leadership skills while maintaining plausible deniability about her role in creating the problems she'd solved. It was masterful manipulation, the work of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of manufactured indispensability, but now I had proof of her methods, and more importantly, I had a platform to share that proof with the very community she'd been manipulating. As I locked up the documentation for the night, I allowed myself a small smile. Eleanor had given me everything I needed to expose her pattern of manufactured crisis and false heroism. Phase 4 of my plan was about to begin, and Eleanor Matthews had no idea that her own festival success was about to become the foundation of her downfall. After all, The most effective traps were the ones your target built for themselves. The Monday morning after the festival, I received an unexpected visitor at my home office. David had already left for work, and I was reviewing the festival documentation when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Eleanor standing on my porch, holding a covered dish and wearing her most maternal smile. "Sarah, dear," she said. When I opened the door, "I brought you some leftover apple crisp from the festival. Thought you might enjoy it after all your hard work this weekend." The irony wasn't lost on me, Eleanor offering me food after what I now knew about her history with culinary sabotage. But her visit wasn't really about apple crisp. It was reconnaissance. "How thoughtful," I said, accepting the dish. "Would you like some coffee?" As we sat in my kitchen, Eleanor's eyes catalogued everything: my laptop on the counter, the festival folders scattered across the dining table, the church directory updates I'd been working on. She was gathering intelligence while maintaining the facade of a caring mother-in-law. "You've thrown yourself into church work so enthusiastically," she observed, stirring her coffee with deliberate slowness. "I hope you're not overwhelming yourself. Sometimes new members try to do too much too quickly." The warning was subtle but clear: know your place, don't move too fast. "I'm just trying to be helpful," I replied. The festival seemed to go well, despite a few hiccups. Eleanor's expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Hiccups? The bounce house, the cotton candy machine. But you handled everything beautifully. It's amazing how you seem to know exactly what to do." "Experience," she said firmly. 20 years of organizing events teaches you to anticipate problems." I nodded admiringly. "It's like you could predict what would go wrong." "That backup cotton candy vendor was inspired. How did you know to have them on standby?" For just a moment, Eleanor's mask slipped. I saw calculation in her eyes, the mental scramble of someone trying to determine how much I knew versus how much. "I was guessing." "Good planning," she said finally. "Always have contingencies." After she left, I knew my investigation had entered a new phase. Eleanor was suspicious, which meant I needed to accelerate my timeline while being even more careful about covering my tracks. I spent the afternoon analyzing everything I'd gathered over the past months: the historical complaints, the vendor contracts, the witness statements, the festival documentation. Individually, each piece was circumstantial. Together, they painted a clear picture of a woman who'd spent decades manipulating her community through carefully orchestrated crises and false narratives. But evidence was useless without an audience, and I needed to present my findings in a way that would be believed rather than dismissed as the vindictive accusations of a bitter daughter-in-law. The solution came to me while reviewing the church's social media analytics. Our online engagement had increased dramatically since I'd started managing the digital platforms. People were sharing our content, commenting on posts, and using our hashtags to spread church-related news throughout the community. More importantly, our audience extended far beyond current church members. Former members who'd moved away still followed our pages. Community members from other congregations engaged with our content. Local business owners and civic leaders had started paying attention to our digital presence. I had built a platform that reached exactly the people Eleanor had spent years carefully managing and controlling, but now they were seeing information she couldn't filter or manipulate. My strategy would unfold in 3 phases: documentation, revelation, and validation. Each phase would build on the previous one, creating an unstoppable momentum that would expose Eleanor's true nature while making it impossible for her to mount an effective defense. Phase 1 began with what I called the Archives Project. I announced through the church newsletter and social media that we were digitizing historical church documents to preserve our community's heritage. It seemed like an innocent initiative that aligned perfectly with Eleanor's love of church history. "What a wonderful idea," she said when I presented the project to the church board. "Our history is so important to preserve for future generations." But the Archives Project served a dual purpose. While genuinely preserving church history, it also gave me a legitimate reason to research and publicize information that had been buried or forgotten. The historical complaints I discovered were just the beginning. Systematic research revealed patterns of behavior that stretched back to Eleanor's earliest days at the church. I started with feel-good content that couldn't possibly threaten Eleanor. Blog posts about church founders, photo galleries from past decades, interviews with longtime members sharing favorite memories. Each piece was carefully crafted to build credibility and engagement while establishing the archives project as a trusted source of church history. The response exceeded my expectations. Former members began reaching out with their own photos and stories. Community members shared memories of church events from years past. Local historians offered to help with research and fact-checking. Most importantly, people began asking questions about gaps in the official church narrative. Why had Pastor Gardner left so suddenly in 2003? What happened to the youth programs that used to be so popular in the 1990s? Why had several prominent families stopped attending around the same time in the late 1990s? I didn't answer these questions directly. Instead, I encouraged people to share their own memories and perspectives. Creating a forum where multiple voices could contribute to a more complete picture of church history, the result was a gradual revelation of patterns that had been invisible when viewed in isolation but became clear when assembled chronologically. People began connecting dots they hadn't even realized existed. Eleanor noticed the shift. I could see it in the way she monitored the church's social media accounts, the careful questions she asked about my research methods, the subtle attempts to steer conversations away from certain time periods or topics. We should focus on positive stories, she suggested during a communications committee meeting. People want to hear about successes and celebrations, not old controversies. But it was too late. The community's appetite for the complete story had been awakened, and simple censorship would only raise more questions. Phase 2 launched with a seemingly innocent blog post titled, Crisis Management: How Our Church Family Supports Each Other. It featured stories about how the congregation had rallied during various emergencies over the years, natural disasters, family tragedies, community challenges. The post included a section on lessons learned from event planning that discussed the importance of backup plans, vendor reliability, and safety protocols. I used the recent festival as a case study, praising Eleanor's crisis management while also documenting the specific failures that had required her intervention. Mrs. Matthews's experience showed the value of preparing for equipment failures. I wrote. Her decision to have backup vendors on standby prevented what could have been major disappointments for festival attendees. On the surface, it was pure praise. But anyone who read carefully would notice several interesting details. Eleanor had specifically chosen vendors with known reliability issues, she'd been remarkably well positioned to respond to each crisis, and she'd dismissed safety warnings. That proved prophetic. The post generated significant discussion in the comments section. Several people shared their own experiences with event planning, comparing notes about vendor reliability and safety protocols. Others mentioned similar patterns they'd noticed at other church events over the years. Most revealing were the comments from former church members who'd been following the archives project from afar. They began sharing their own memories of Eleanor's crisis management, describing instances where her solutions had seemed almost too convenient or well prepared. I always wondered how she knew to bring extra sound equipment to the Christmas pageant in 1999, wrote one former member. It was like she knew the church's system would fail. Remember the food poisoning at the potluck dinner in 2001, added another. Eleanor was the only one who brought store-bought items instead of homemade, and she kept saying how worried she was about food safety. Then half the people who ate homemade dishes got sick. The comments section became a digital archaeology dig, with former members excavating memories of incidents that had seemed isolated at the time but revealed a clear pattern when viewed together. Eleanor's response was swift and calculated. She began her own comment campaign, positioning herself as the humble servant who'd simply learned from experience to prepare for problems that unfortunately occurred despite everyone's best efforts. I've just been blessed with good planning skills, she wrote in response to several comments. When you've seen things go wrong before, you learn to prepare for contingencies. I wish I could prevent problems entirely, but at least I can help minimize their impact. It was a masterful deflection that reframed the conversation from her role in creating problems to her skill in solving them. But it also confirmed that she was actively monitoring the digital discussion and felt threatened enough to respond. Personally, Phase 3 would turn that defensive posture against her. I had been secretly recording conversations with Eleanor's knowledge and consent, a perfectly legal practice in our state when one party agrees to the recording. During our various committee meetings and planning sessions, I'd captured hours of Eleanor making statements that contradicted her public persona, the most damaging recordings were from private conversations where Eleanor had explicitly admitted to manipulating situations to maintain her authority. During one planning meeting for the Christmas pageant, she'd said, "Sometimes you have to let people fail a little bit so they appreciate your help. Otherwise they start thinking they don't need you." In another recording, she discussed her strategy for managing problematic church members. The key is to let them embarrass themselves publicly. Once they've lost credibility, you can step in as the voice of reason and people will be grateful for your leadership. But I couldn't simply release these recordings without proper context and corroboration. The community needed to be prepared. To hear Eleanor's own words describing her manipulation tactics, the preparation came through a new series called Leadership Lessons from Church History. Each post examined a different aspect of church governance, using historical examples to discuss effective versus problematic leadership styles. One post focused on the importance of transparency in decision-making, highlighting instances where secretive or manipulative approaches had damaged church communities. Another examined building up versus tearing down, discussing how true leaders elevated others rather than undermining potential rivals. Each post was carefully researched and professionally written, presenting generally accepted principles of healthy organizational behavior. But the principles I chose to highlight were specifically selected to provide a framework for evaluating Eleanor's leadership style. The community response was overwhelmingly positive. People appreciated the thoughtful analysis and began applying the leadership principles to their own experiences within the church. More importantly, they started recognizing behaviors and patterns they'd previously accepted as normal parts of church politics. "I never thought about it before, but we really should have more transparency in our committee decision-making," wrote Tom, the treasurer, in response to one post. "Sometimes it feels like important choices are made behind closed doors and then presented as already decided." Others began questioning why certain voices always seemed to dominate discussions, why some members' ideas were consistently overlooked, and why there seemed to be such a high turnover in volunteer leadership positions. The digital conversation was creating exactly the kind of critical thinking that Eleanor's authority couldn't survive. People were developing the analytical tools to evaluate her behavior objectively rather than simply accepting her version of events. As I reviewed the engagement metrics on our church's digital platforms, I realized I'd achieved something remarkable. I'd created a community conversation that was entirely legitimate, educational, and constructive, but was systematically dismantling the foundation of Eleanor's power. She couldn't object to posts about church history without seeming to oppose transparency. She couldn't criticize leadership development content without appearing defensive. She couldn't control the narrative because the conversation had grown beyond any single person's ability to manage. Most importantly, I'd positioned myself not as Eleanor's accuser but as a neutral facilitator of community dialogue. When the time came to present more damaging evidence, I would already be seen as a credible source committed to truth and transparency rather than personal vendetta. Eleanor was beginning to realize that something fundamental had shifted in her kingdom. The conversations happening online and in church hallways were no longer following her carefully managed script. People were asking questions she couldn't easily deflect and making connections she couldn't control, but she still didn't understand the full scope of what was happening or how comprehensively her authority was being undermined. That revelation was coming soon, and when it arrived, Eleanor Matthews would discover that the digital age had rules very different from the close community politics she'd mastered over the past 30 years. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and she wouldn't even see it coming until it was far too late to mount an effective defense. The breaking point came during the December church board meeting, when Eleanor made a mistake that revealed just how desperate she'd become. I wasn't even supposed to be there. Communications coordinators didn't typically attend board meetings, but Pastor Wilson had asked me to present the year-end digital engagement report. The numbers were impressive. Website traffic was up 300%. Social media engagement had increased by 400%, and our online community now included over 800 active participants, many of whom were former members who'd reconnected with the church through our digital outreach. "Sarah's work has been transformational," Pastor Wilson told the board. "We're reaching people we haven't heard from in years, and our community engagement has never been stronger." Eleanor sat at the far end of the conference table, her smile growing more strained with each positive metric I presented. When I mentioned the success of the Archives project and its role in reconnecting former members with church history, her hands tightened visibly around her coffee cup. "That's all very impressive," she said when I finished my presentation. "But I hope we're being careful about which stories we choose to highlight. Not all history needs to be rehashed, especially if it might upset people or create unnecessary controversy." Board member Janet Morrison, who'd been quietly rebuilding her influence in the church community, raised an eyebrow. What kind of controversy would church history create? Eleanor realized she'd stepped into dangerous territory. "Oh, nothing specific. I just think we should focus on positive, uplifting stories rather than dwelling on past difficulties." "But isn't learning from past difficulties part of how we grow as a community?" asked Tom, the treasurer. "Some of the most valuable discussions I've seen online have been about lessons learned from challenging periods." Eleanor's composure was beginning to crack. "Some things are better left in the past. Dragging up old conflicts and disappointments doesn't serve anyone's spiritual growth." The room fell silent. Eleanor had essentially admitted there were conflicts and disappointments she wanted to keep buried, which naturally made everyone wonder what those might be. Pastor Wilson, ever the diplomat, tried to smooth things over. "I think we can trust Sarah's judgment about appropriate content. Her work has been nothing but positive for our church community." But Eleanor wasn't finished. In a moment of panic-driven poor judgment, she made the error that would ultimately destroy her. "I'm just concerned about amateur historians making assumptions or spreading misinformation," she said, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard her use in public before. "Professional archivists understand the importance of context and accuracy. We can't have people with limited experience making inflammatory claims about long-standing church members." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor had essentially called me incompetent and suggested I was spreading lies about respected church members, specifically about her. Janet Morrison's response was swift and devastating. "Are you suggesting Sarah has been inaccurate in her research? Because I've reviewed quite a bit of her historical work, and it's been exceptionally well documented and carefully presented." "I'm not making accusations," Eleanor backpedaled quickly. "I'm simply advocating for professional standards." "What professional standards has Sarah failed to meet?" pressed Tom. "Her background is in strategic communications, which seems perfectly relevant to church communications work." Eleanor realized she'd painted herself into a corner. She couldn't provide specific examples of my supposed incompetence without revealing her real concern, that I was uncovering truths she wanted to keep hidden. "I think we're getting off track," she said, attempting to regain control. "I simply believe in maintaining appropriate boundaries around sensitive historical matters." But the damage was done. Eleanor had revealed her hand, showing the board that she was personally threatened by the Archives project and willing to attack my credibility to protect her own interests. Worse, she'd done it in front of witnesses who'd been watching the gradual revelation of her manipulation tactics through my digital campaigns. They now had a framework for understanding her defensive behavior, and the context to recognize it as self-serving rather than community-minded. After the meeting, several board members approached me privately to express support for my work and concern about Eleanor's unexpected hostility. "I've never seen her react like that," confided Dr. Stevens, who'd served on the board for over a decade. "It was almost like she was afraid of something being discovered." Pastor Wilson was more direct. "Sarah, I want you to know that your work has my complete support. If Eleanor has specific concerns about accuracy or methodology, she should address them through proper channels rather than making vague accusations." Most importantly, Janet Morrison pulled me aside as we left the church building. "I know exactly what's happening here," she said quietly. "Eleanor's afraid because your research is uncovering the patterns some of us have noticed for years. She's finally facing accountability, and she doesn't know how to handle it." "What patterns?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "The way people who challenge her suddenly have problems. The way her solutions to crises seem a little too convenient. The way former members just disappeared without anyone really understanding why." Janet paused. "I never had proof before. Just suspicions. But your documentation is making connections that were invisible when viewed individually." That conversation confirmed what I'd suspected. I wasn't the only one who'd noticed Eleanor's manipulation tactics. I was just the first person with the skills and motivation to document them systematically. The following week, I received a call that changed everything. Margaret Foster, the former pianist Eleanor had driven away in 1998, had been following our digital archives project and wanted to meet. I saw the discussion about church leadership and crisis management, she said when we met at the same coffee shop where I'd first interviewed Janet. It brought back memories I've been trying to forget for 25 years. Margaret had brought a box of documents, copies of everything related to her departure from the church. Letters, emails, meeting minutes, and most importantly, a detailed journal she'd kept during her final months as church pianist. I started writing everything down when I realized what Eleanor was doing, she explained. I wanted to document the systematic campaign against me in case I ever needed to defend myself. The journal was devastating. Margaret had recorded specific incidents, dates, and witnesses for Eleanor's manipulation campaign. More importantly, she'd documented the aftermath, how Eleanor had positioned herself as the solution to the music ministry crisis she'd created. Look at this entry from March 15, 1998, Margaret said, pointing to a page of careful handwriting. Eleanor suggested to 3 different families that my music choices were becoming inappropriate for traditional worship. She didn't tell them. She disagreed with me directly, she framed it as concern about what other people might think. Margaret flipped through several more pages. Here's where she started the rumor that I wasn't open to feedback about song selections. She told the worship committee that she'd tried to offer gentle suggestions but I'd been defensive and unreceptive. Had she actually tried to give you feedback? Never. Not once did Eleanor speak to me directly about any concerns. Everything was communicated through other people, which meant I was always responding to secondhand information while she maintained the appearance of being diplomatic and considerate. The most damning evidence was Margaret's documentation of the organ Sabotage. She'd recorded her conversation with the service technician who'd examined the instrument after the Easter disaster. He told me the malfunction wasn't mechanical, Margaret said quietly. Someone had deliberately disconnected internal wiring in a way that would cause intermittent failures. The damage was clearly intentional, but cleverly done to look like equipment failure. Did you report this to church leadership? Margaret's laugh was bitter. I tried. But who was I going to accuse? Eleanor was the one suggesting I might need better equipment training. She'd positioned herself as my supporter, someone who understood that technology could be challenging for people without formal training. The parallels to my own experience were chilling. Eleanor had used the same playbook for decades: create problems, offer solutions, and position herself as the wise voice who tried to prevent the very disasters she'd orchestrated. But Margaret had something I hadn't expected: the service technician's written report documenting the intentional sabotage. She'd kept it for 25 years, unable to prove who was responsible but unwilling to let the evidence disappear. Why? Are you sharing this now? I asked. Because I've been watching what you're doing with the church's digital presence, Margaret said. You're creating something I never had, a platform where multiple voices can be heard, where patterns can be recognized, where individual incidents can be connected to reveal larger truths. Margaret agreed to participate in a recorded interview about church music history, ostensibly for the Archives project but actually to get her story on the record. Her account would provide crucial historical context for understanding Eleanor's long-term behavior patterns, but the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Pastor Gardner, Eleanor's previous pastoral victim, had been following our digital archives from his retirement home in Florida. He called the church office and asked to speak with me personally. Mrs. Matthews, he said when I returned his call, I've been watching the conversations happening around your church history project. I think it's time I shared some information that might be helpful for your archives. Pastor Gardner had kept copies of everything: his correspondence with denominational leadership, documentation of Eleanor's interference with church programs, and detailed records of the systematic campaign that had ultimately driven him from the ministry. I was a young pastor then, idealistic about church community and collaborative leadership, he explained during our phone conversation. I didn't understand what I was up against until it was too late. Pastor Gardner's documentation revealed that Eleanor's manipulation extended far beyond individual victims. She'd systematically undermined several church programs that didn't originate with her or serve her interests. The youth group was thriving under Pastor Sarah Williams' leadership, he told me. But Eleanor didn't approve of some of Sarah's more contemporary approaches to youth ministry. She started a whisper campaign about inappropriate activities, safety concerns, and parental complaints that didn't actually exist. What happened to Pastor Sarah? She resigned after a series of incidents that made her position untenable. The youth retreat she'd organized was sabotaged, food poisoning that affected most of the kids but mysteriously spared the adult chaperones Eleanor had recommended. The equipment for the Christmas youth service malfunctioned repeatedly. Her proposals for youth programs were consistently rejected by committees Eleanor influenced. The pattern was unmistakable and damning. Eleanor had spent decades systematically removing anyone who challenged her authority or offered alternative approaches to church life, but Pastor Gardner had something even more valuable than documentation. He had contacts. Other pastors who'd dealt with similar situations, denominational officials who'd received complaints about Eleanor's behavior, and a network of former church members who'd been driven away by her tactics. I've been in touch with several families who left First Baptist during my tenure, he said. They've been following your archives project and would be willing to share their stories if you think it would be helpful. By the end of our conversation, I realized the scope of Eleanor's destructive influence was far larger than I'd imagined. She hadn't just manipulated individual situations, she'd systematically prevented the church from growing, changing, or developing leadership beyond her control. More importantly, I now had a network of witnesses, documentation spanning decades, and physical evidence of deliberate sabotage. The case against Eleanor was no longer circumstantial, it was overwhelming, but I also understood that presenting this evidence required careful strategy. Eleanor still had allies, David was still her son, and the church community would need time to process the full scope of her deception. The revelation would need to unfold naturally, allowing people to reach their own conclusions rather than feeling like they were being attacked with accusations they weren't prepared to believe. Fortunately, Eleanor was about to provide the perfect opportunity for her own downfall. The Christmas pageant was approaching, and she'd once again positioned herself as the indispensable coordinator of the church's most important annual event. Based on her historical pattern, Eleanor would create manageable crises that allowed her to demonstrate her leadership skills while reinforcing her narrative of competent crisis management. But this time, I would be ready. Every move she made would be documented, every crisis she created would be anticipated, and every solution she offered would be exposed as the manipulation it truly was. Eleanor Matthews had spent 30 years perfecting her methods of community control. Now she was about to discover what happened when those same methods were turned against her by someone who understood her playbook better than she did herself. The Christmas pageant would be Eleanor's final performance, though she didn't know it yet. And when the curtain fell, the only applause would be for the end of her reign of manipulation and fear. The Christmas pageant was set for December 22nd, and Eleanor had been planning it since October with her usual meticulous attention to detail. But this year, I was watching her preparations with the analytical eye of someone who understood her methods. Every vendor choice, every backup plan, every contingency she prepared told me exactly where she intended to create her traditional manageable crises. The pattern was predictable now that I knew what to look for. Eleanor would ensure small, visible problems occurred during the pageant, technical difficulties, costume malfunctions, minor emergencies that allowed her to sweep in as the competent leader who saved the day. It was theater, carefully choreographed to reinforce her indispensability while maintaining plausible deniability about her role in creating the problems she solved. But this year would be different. This year, I had 30 witnesses ready to document everything, security cameras positioned to capture her movements, and a digital platform that reached far beyond the church walls. Eleanor was about to perform her manipulation tactics in front of the largest, most attentive audience she'd ever had. The week before the pageant, my carefully orchestrated revelation began with a seemingly innocent blog post titled, "Christmas Pageant Memories, 3 Decades of Tradition." The post featured photos and stories from pageants going back to Eleanor's early years at the church, creating a nostalgic timeline that would seem celebratory to casual readers, but embedded within the cheerful reminiscences were subtle details that painted a different picture for anyone paying attention. Year after year, the pageant had faced similar technical difficulties. Sound systems failed with remarkable consistency. Costumes required last-minute emergency repairs. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that created dramatic moments but were always resolved by Eleanor's foresight and preparation. The post generated enormous engagement, with current and former church members sharing their own pageant memories. But some of those memories were troubling when viewed in aggregate. "I remember 2003, wrote one former member. The spotlight kept cutting out during Mary's solo, but Mrs. Matthews had backup lighting ready. It was almost like she knew it would happen." 2007 was the year the backdrop fell down right before the shepherd scene, added another. "Good thing." Mrs. Matthews had suggested extra supports earlier that week. More concerning were the memories from parents whose children had participated in pageants over the years. Several mentioned last-minute costume crises that were mysteriously resolved by Eleanor's advanced preparation, technical problems that occurred right on schedule, and equipment failures that seemed to happen at the most dramatically opportune moments. The comments section became a digital archaeology dig, with participants excavating memories that had seemed unremarkable at the time but revealed a disturbing pattern when assembled chronologically. Eleanor had been orchestrating pageant crises for decades, using Christmas, the church's most sacred celebration, as an annual opportunity to demonstrate her indispensability, but the most damaging revelation came from Jenny Walsh, a professional stage manager who'd volunteered for several pageants in the early 2000s before moving away. "I always wondered about those technical failures," she wrote in a detailed comment. "In professional theater, we test everything multiple times and have redundant systems specifically to prevent the kinds of problems that seem to happen every year at the pageant. The failures were always in systems that had been tested successfully. Just hours before the performance." Jenny's professional perspective provided the missing piece of the puzzle. The technical failures weren't random equipment problems. They were deliberately induced malfunctions that required insider knowledge to create and insider preparation to resolve. Eleanor noticed the online discussion and attempted damage control. But her response only made things worse. "It's wonderful to see so many fond memories of our pageants," she posted. "I've always believed in being prepared for any eventuality. When you've been organizing events as long as I have, you learn to anticipate problems before they occur." The phrase, "anticipate problems before they occur," became a lightning rod for criticism. Former members began questioning how someone could consistently predict specific technical failures unless they had advanced knowledge of what was going to go wrong. As pageant week arrived, Eleanor was visibly tense in a way I'd never seen before. The online discussion had rattled her confidence, and she was struggling to maintain her usual commanding presence during rehearsals. Meanwhile, I'd been working behind the scenes with a team of volunteers who understood what was really happening. Tom the treasurer, Janet Morrison, Pastor Wilson, and several board members had agreed to help document the evening's events from multiple angles. We had cameras positioned throughout the sanctuary, audio recording equipment to capture conversations, and a real-time social media monitoring system to track how events unfolded online. Most importantly, we'd contacted the vendor Eleanor had chosen for the sound system, the same company that had provided equipment for several previous pageants where technical failures had occurred. Their service technician, a young man named Mike, had some interesting observations about the equipment requests over the years. "Mrs. Matthews always insisted on using our older mixing board," he told me during a pre-pageant consultation. Said, "It was more reliable than our newer digital systems. But honestly, the older equipment is much more prone to the kinds of failures she always seemed ready for." Mike agreed to arrive early on pageant night to conduct a thorough equipment check and remain available throughout the performance to monitor the sound system. His presence would make it much more difficult for Eleanor to create her traditional technical difficulties without being observed. December 22nd arrived with the crisp air and excited energy that always surrounded the Christmas pageant. Families gathered in the sanctuary as children in angel costumes and shepherd robes prepared for their annual performance. Eleanor moved through the controlled chaos like a general preparing for battle, checking and rechecking every detail, but something was different this year. The careful documentation of her historical patterns had created a heightened awareness among the audience. People weren't just watching the pageant, they were watching Eleanor, noting her movements, observing her interactions with equipment and personnel, the performance began flawlessly. Mary and Joseph made their journey to Bethlehem without incident. The angels announced Christ's birth with perfect harmonies and functioning microphones. The shepherds received their heavenly vision while standing on a stable platform with reliable lighting. For the first 40 minutes of the pageant, nothing went wrong. Eleanor's increasingly desperate attempts to position herself near various pieces of equipment became more obvious as the evening progressed without providing her any opportunities to demonstrate her crisis management skills. Then, during the crucial moment when the wise men approached the manger scene, the wireless microphone system began cutting out intermittently. It was the exact kind of technical difficulty that had plagued previous pageants, occurring at a dramatically significant moment when the malfunction would be most noticeable, but this time, everyone was ready. Mike, the sound technician, immediately checked his equipment and discovered that someone had loosened several antenna connections in a way that would cause intermittent signal loss. The damage was subtle enough to seem like equipment failure but deliberate enough to be easily repaired by someone who knew what to look for. More importantly, the security cameras captured Eleanor near the sound equipment during the pre-performance setup, and several witnesses observed her handling the antenna connections while claiming to dust the equipment. As Mike quickly repaired the intentional damage, Eleanor prepared to step forward with her traditional offer of backup solutions and calming leadership. But Pastor Wilson was ready with his own response. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced from the pulpit as the sound system was restored, "it appears we've had some technical difficulties that were quickly resolved by our professional technician. Let's continue with our celebration of Christ's birth." Eleanor's moment of heroic intervention never materialized. Instead, she was left standing in the wings, her prepared backup solutions unnecessary, her crisis management skills unneeded. But the real revelation came during the post-pageant reception, when Mike approached Pastor Wilson with his findings. "Reverend, I need to show you something," he said, producing photos of the deliberately loosened connections. "This wasn't equipment failure. Someone intentionally sabotaged the sound system." The conversation took place in the fellowship hall, within earshot of dozens of church members who were still processing what they'd witnessed during the pageant. Word spread quickly through the gathering as people began connecting Mike's discovery to the online discussions about Eleanor's historical crisis management patterns. Eleanor realized what was happening and attempted to control the narrative one final time. "How terrible that someone would deliberately damage church equipment," she said loudly, positioning herself as an outraged victim rather than the perpetrator. "We should call the police immediately to investigate this vandalism." But Janet Morrison was ready with a response that sealed Eleanor's fate. "Actually, Eleanor, we have security footage of the incident," she said calmly. "Perhaps we should review that before involving law enforcement." The fellowship hall fell silent. Eleanor's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, fear, and finally, defeated recognition that her decades-long game was over. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said weakly, but her voice carried none of its usual authority. Pastor Wilson took control of the situation with the gentle firmness that had made him an effective leader. "Eleanor, I think it would be best if we discussed this privately," he said. "Janet, Tom, would you join us in my office?" As Eleanor was escorted away from the reception, the fellowship hall erupted in conversations as 30 years of suppressed suspicions finally found their voice. People who'd always wondered about Eleanor's convenient solutions began sharing their own experiences with her manipulation tactics. Former members who'd been following the digital discussion felt vindicated in their decision to leave. Current members who'd felt intimidated by Eleanor's authority realized they weren't alone in their concerns. The online revelation was swift and overwhelming. Within hours, the security footage had been shared across multiple platforms. Mike's technical report was being discussed throughout the community, and Eleanor's pattern of manufactured crises was being analyzed by hundreds of former and current church members. But the most powerful response came from the victims of Eleanor's previous campaigns. Margaret Foster published her full journal online, documenting Eleanor's systematic destruction of her music ministry. Pastor Gardner released his correspondence with denominational leadership, revealing decades of warnings about Eleanor's manipulative behavior. Former church members shared their own stories of harassment, intimidation, and forced departures. The revelation wasn't just about a single incident of equipment sabotage, it was about 30 years of systematic manipulation, control, and abuse. Disguised as Christian leadership. Eleanor's resignation from all church positions came the following Monday, delivered through her lawyer rather than in person. She claimed health issues and a desire to step back from public service, but everyone understood the real reason for her departure. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. The church board launched a formal investigation into Eleanor's historical behavior, working with denominational leadership to ensure proper accountability. A victim support group was established for people who'd been harmed by her manipulation tactics. New governance policies were implemented to prevent any single person from accumulating unchecked authority. Most importantly, the church community began the healing process that Eleanor's presence had prevented for decades. Former members returned, new leadership emerged, and the atmosphere of fear and intimidation that had characterized Eleanor's reign was replaced by genuine collaboration and mutual respect. As for David and me, the revelation created a crisis in our marriage that took months to resolve. David struggled to accept the evidence of his mother's systematic cruelty, and for a while it seemed our relationship might not survive the truth about the woman who'd raised him, but gradually, as more evidence emerged and more victims came forward, David began to understand the extent of the manipulation he'd witnessed throughout his life. He started therapy to process the realization that his mother's behavior wasn't normal parental concern but pathological control. Eleanor herself moved to a retirement community in another state, far from the scene of her exposed crimes. She never admitted wrongdoing or apologized to her victims, maintaining to the end that she'd been misunderstood and unfairly persecuted, but her reputation was permanently destroyed. The digital documentation of her manipulation tactics became a case study in toxic leadership that was shared throughout our denomination and beyond. Other churches began recognizing similar patterns in their own communities and taking steps to prevent the kind of systematic abuse Eleanor had perfected. 6 months after the Christmas pageant revelation, I stood in the same fellowship hall where Eleanor's empire had finally crumbled. But now it was filled with laughter, genuine warmth, and the kind of community spirit that had been suppressed. For decades, the room was decorated for my first anniversary celebration, not my wedding anniversary, which still carried painful memories, but the anniversary of my first day at First Baptist Church. The community had insisted on celebrating the transformation that had begun with my arrival and culminated in Eleanor's exposure. Pastor Wilson presented me with a plaque recognizing my contributions to church communications and historical preservation. But the real reward was seeing the faces around me, people who'd been marginalized, silenced, or driven away by Eleanor's tactics, now thriving in a community that valued their contributions. Janet Morrison approached me as the celebration wound down. "You know, Sarah, what you accomplished here goes far beyond exposing one person's bad behavior," she said. "You showed an entire community how to recognize manipulation, how to document abuse, and how to reclaim their power from someone who'd stolen it." She was right. Eleanor's downfall hadn't just removed a toxic influence, it had educated a community about the subtle ways power could be abused and provided tools for preventing future manipulation. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey from my sabotaged wedding reception to Eleanor's public exposure. It had taken 8 months of careful planning, strategic positioning, and systematic documentation to bring down someone who'd spent 30 years perfecting her manipulation tactics. But the most satisfying aspect wasn't Eleanor's destruction, it was the construction of something better in its place. A church community that valued transparency over control, collaboration over domination, and truth over carefully crafted false narratives. Eleanor Matthews had taught me that reputation was everything in a small community. She'd used that lesson to destroy my wedding day and attempt to destroy my standing in the church. In return, I'd shown her that reputation could indeed be everything, but only if it was built on truth rather than manipulation, service rather than self-interest, and genuine care for others rather than pathological need for control. The woman who'd spent decades using food as a weapon of humiliation had finally tasted the bitter dish of public accountability. And unlike the cake she'd sabotaged at my wedding, this was a meal she'd prepared entirely for herself. Justice, I discovered, was best served cold, methodically planned, and documented with the kind of professional precision that left no room for escape or denial. Eleanor Matthews had declared war on me on my wedding day. But in the end, she'd lost far more than a battle. she'd lost everything she'd spent a lifetime building, and the community she'd terrorized was finally free to become what it was always meant to be. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying your enemy, it's creating something so much better that their absence becomes a blessing everyone can see and appreciate. The queen was dead. Long live the community. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.